Hello, I am Patricia Sanchez, Roman's chess student and chess enthusiast. Grandmaster Roman Gingi-Hashvili, a Russian and American champion, is continuing his widely successful and popular instructional series on this DVD. He will be focusing on the specifics of certain openings that he is famous for. Playing and understanding openings recommended by Roman will help you determine the entire course of the game. So grab your chess set and notebook and prepare to strengthen and enhance your chess skills.
I got a lot of requests to analyze deeper certain opening, this and that opening, or make some tape, some DVD on one or the other opening. And I can only satisfy those who is asking me to make a specific tape on the openings that I am specialized in. So matter of our discussion now is going to be English opening for white. Okay, the reason why I bring the English opening, because I have my certain ways, my certain take on English opening, the way to play it, and it's relatively easy opening to learn. For example, I cannot make one tape on open Sicilian, on regular Sicilian, because you can make there about 150 tapes, and one subject of Sicilian I'm very specialized for white is Grand Prix attack, and for black is accelerated dragon. So Sicilian, English opening is one that I know relatively well, and I have my own ways, and I can bring you and teach you how to play English opening easy way without going into very complicated variations, and help you understanding English opening and playing it correctly. Then you will guarantee to get good position in easy way. So we go c4 is the first move. That's how English opening starts. And even though you do play English opening, you think you play English opening by playing c4, I have to tell you that it's not guaranteed you're gonna get English. For example, black may go e6 and d5, second move, regardless what white plays d5. Then we will get either either Queen's Gambit declined, or we may get ready opening, knight f3, d5, and g3, or we can get knight f3, d5, and d4, followed by g3, which will be Catalan. So there are several ways you can play against c4 and e6. You are not gonna get English opening. But then if black plays e6 and d5, that narrows black's possibilities. For instance, if on first move d4, you're playing player who normally plays King's Indian. Well, for him, it's very unlikely to get from him the e6 first move, because he will never get the King's Indian then. And if you go d4, the King's Indian player will be forced to play something like Nimzo Indian or Queen's Gambit. So they will not want. So by playing c4, you either gonna get English opening, or you will make your opponent play some openings that he wasn't originally planned on playing against d4 or c4. So when you play c4, e6 is the one way to avoid English opening, and c6 is the other way. Now, when they play against you c6, you have several choices. Again, you can play e4, and after d5, get pan of attack in Caro-Kann, or after c4, c6, you can go d4 and get Slav defense, or you can go knight f3 and after d5 go g3. get ready opening. Well, those are all these choices. Now, obviously, we are not going to look at them at all choices for white. We are obligated to look at every choice for black, but the idea of the tape is to give you one recommended line on every variation black chooses. So we're going to narrow possibilities for white. So I will recommend you something, and if you choose to play differently, then you have to use your own sources. So C4, C6, and C4, E6. That will avoid English. Well, otherwise, by playing C4, of course not counting some pointless continuations such as B5 and CBA6, we are not going to be looking at unsound pawn sacrifices. So then we will get an English opening unless black plays E6 or C6. On knight F6, for example, we go knight C3, and again they can go E6, and then we have a choice to go E4 to English, one variety of English opening, and go D4, inviting your opponent to play Ninja Indian or Queen's Gambit declined. So when you play C4, and suppose your opponent plays alone with you. So he plays along by playing knight F6, knight C3, and he goes King's Indian. Now we're not going to play King's Indian by playing D4 because we want to play English. So we go G3 and bishop G2, and later on we're going to go D3, and we will cover this. The other way to play after C4, knight F6, knight C3. Now if black goes C5, or actually black could have gone C5 on a first move. So C4, knight F6, knight C3, black still can go C5, and black can go E5. So those are the two type of English openings. It's interesting. It's it's a very rare opening, maybe the only opening in the chess theory where on a first move black can go C5 and E5, and in both cases it's English opening. It's English. So E5 is one way to play on a first move, or after knight F6, knight C3 on a second move, and C5 is the other way to play. Another way to play on a first or the second move. So when we go C5 and knight C4 and knight C3, we can get positions with C5 and positions with E5. So we have to be prepared for them. And interestingly, if you play with white and you play only C4, this is the least amount of theory you need to know than in any other continuations. In any other first move, you have to play with white. Well, of course, what I'm saying is to play modern opening, to count, to play for initiative, to play for opening advantage, and you need to know the least amount of theory, and to get for it. If you go E4, you have to dedicate the lifetime to studying the critical variations and modern openings. Well, with C4, on C5, you have to know certain variations and fight for opening. Of course, you can go G3, bishop G2, knight F3, and D3, and knowing no theory, but then you will get no advantage in the opening at all. C4 is the way to play for initiative. So the continuations are C5 and E5 positions. C5 and E5 positions is two major chapters we have to study, and also we have to look how are we going to play on E6, and I give you one recommended line on that, and how we're going to play on c6, I also will give you the recommended line. So let's start with c4 and e5. Okay, now we go knight c3, and here already black has two continuations. They have actually three continuations. They have knight f6, very popular move, knight c6, also very popular move, and bishop b4 that became popular only in last several years, and it was very popular actually a few years ago, and it's less popular now. So we're going to start in random order, so let's go with bishop b4 move. Now on bishop b4, again, the main move is knight d5. There are moves such as g3, such as knight f3, d3. Well, we cannot analyze them all, as I said, because we are white. So we want to, you want to hear from me what I would recommend. What is the easy way to play this opening? And I do recommend knight f3 move. Now, knight f3 move attacks the e5 pawn. Black has to protect the e5 pawn. How should they protect the e5 pawn? Well, normal move, which big majority of the player would play in this position, is bishop takes c3, and here is why. They will not protect it with knight c6, because then white goes knight d5. You see, in this position, when white goes knight d5, black can go bishop a5, and after b4, c6. So black allows white to play knight d5 with a tempo, and they lose the tempo on retreating the bishop in order to gain it back later with playing c6. So when we play knight f3, knight c6 makes no sense, because after knight d5, white puts knight on d5 with the tempo, and black is going to have hard time removing this knight from d5. So bishop takes c3 is the most expected move in this position. B takes c, and here black has choices again. They have three choices. They can protect the e5 pawn by playing knight c6. They can protect it by playing d6, and they can push the e pawn. Knight c6 move. Now, after knight c6, I would suggest you to play either d3 or g3. Actually, they are both good continuations, and it's more like the way you choose it. It's what more suits your taste. You can go d3 followed by e4 and bishop e2, or you can go g3 followed by bishop g2, castle, and d3. And in every case, white has good position. White has a little better position. e4 move, that's not a good move, because white can go knight d4, and now e4 pawn, it's more of a liability than a strength. I would say the e4 pawn is weak. For example, after knight d4, knight f6, we can even go d3 if we wanted to. And now ed. Now black got rid of their weakness, but after bishop e2, white has bishop pair and better position. So, and well, if they play knight f6 and castle, then white can simply continue with bishop g5 or g3, and they will always have a little better position. It's unlikely black will go e4 here. So d6 is the third move. D6 is the move, it's the most logical move, and it looks like black wants to play knight c6, f5, and knight f6, but here the best move for white is c5, and white gets favorable pawn structure. Let's look at black's choices. White wants to take on d6 and play bishop a3 in the future. Black cannot go e4. This move loses because of queen a4 check, followed by queen takes e4. So black, it's not recommended to play d takes c, because after knight takes e5, white has two bishops advantage with better pawn structure in the center. And if black plays simply knight f6, after c takes d, g3, and black castles, white would go bishop g2, and after knight c6 castling, white's plan is to go d3, c4, rook b1, and bishop a3. Now, there is nothing black can do to stop this plan. For example, if black goes e4, then we can go knight d4. Now, this is not going to be very good for black, because knight takes d4, cd, and even if black supports with d5, later on white plays d3, and dark square bishop will go to g5 or a3. White has easy game. That's what this opening all about. We get an easy game where we know the plan, and you don't have to study bunch of complicated variations. This is the main advantage of this opening. This opening does not guarantee you better positions than after e4 or d4. No, it guarantees you easier life in the opening, where you know what your plan is. Now, in variation c4 and e5, in this type of English, after knight c3, suppose black does not play bishop b4, and actually bishop b4 is not the main move. It's just been popular at some point. So suppose black plays knight c6 or knight f6, or maybe even something like f5. So let's look at these variations. Now, let's start with a move that hardly ever played now. It's not very popular move. f5. We go d4. That's what I would recommend to play. E takes d, and queen takes d4. Now, this is not very good position for black, because after knight c6, because pawn on f5 stands real badly. After knight c6, you can go queen e3 check, and now I would say queen e7 is a bad move, because white can go knight d5, and black does not really have good position. After queen takes e3, bishop takes e3, they have difficulties with the c7 pawn, and after king d8, knight f3, white simply have clear advantage. So after queen to e3 check, in this position, black should play bishop e7, and then after knight to d5, white is clearly better. You see, knight d5 is a very strong move, preventing knight f6, after which white is going to play simply knight takes f6, leaving black with horrible pawn structure after gf. No, but f5 move is not the one you would normally see. So after knight c3, so now that we put it out of the way, so there are two major moves besides the bishop b4. So there are knight c6 and knight f6. Now after knight c6, again, now you have a choice here. My choice is g3. However, knight f3, well, you can say maybe just as well be played knight f3. Now after knight f3 and knight f6, white can play d3. That's what I play lately a lot. And after d5, cd, knight takes d5. For those who likes to play with black Sicilian, this position will be very comfortable. Now you have Sicilian pawn structure and type of position for white with extra tempo. This is one way to play, and the other way to play is, instead of knight f3, to go simply g3. And if black goes knight f6, then bishop g2, and now black goes probably bishop b4, and you can go either knight d5, or you can even go knight f3, or you can go d3. There are many different ways to play this position for white. Now I don't really want to go into detailed analysis of this position. My choice would be here knight to d5, and further on to continue with knight f3 and castling in d4. This would be my choice, and I would recommend to play this way. There are a lot of games played with it, and I cannot offer any of my own analysis there because whatever theory says and whatever the database shows us is very satisfactory for white. So we go g3 now, but if black goes f5, we go bishop g2 and knight f6, then we can simply play knight f3. I would recommend this move. Do not be afraid of e4. I don't think e4 is a good move because we simply go knight h4, attacking the f5 pawn. Black cannot play g5 because f5 pawn hangs, and if black protects f5 pawn, then we go d3. We attacking the central pawn on e4, and black never has a chance to play g5. This is not a very good position for black because after e takes d, there are two different ways you can get an advantage for white. You can take with the queen and attacking f5 pawn, and take with the pawn. Now your knight on h4 is no longer in danger, and after you castle, pawn on f5 is a big liability for black, so white does have a clear advantage. So now let's look what happens if we go g3 and after f5 bishop g2, knight f6, knight f3, and now if black goes bishop b5 before, white can simply go knight d5. Now what is this position? This position is the same position if we played for white on my previous tapes. I recommended very much to play for white Grand Prix kind of position. Well, that's what black has now. Black has white's Grand Prix pawn structure and position, but extra tempo for white makes great difference. So this, after bishop before knight d5, I simply don't like black's position. Now if black goes bishop c5, then we can go d3, threatening bishop g5. Very comfortable position and very good position for white. So I don't think you're going to see much of f5 in those positions after g3. So what you're likely to see is either knight f6, bishop g2, bishop b4, and I recommended you to go knight d5, or you may see after g3, g6, most expected. We go bishop g2, bishop g7, and now we go d3. Here is the position and actually the pawn structure that I want to talk about very, very carefully. Now d3, d6, knight f3, and now it all depends how black develops their knight on g8. Black can go knight f6, black can go knight to e7, or black can play f5 followed by knight f6. White's plan in all of those cases, White's plan does not change. White sticks to the same plan. We don't know what black wants. If black goes knight f6, we castle. But you can also play bishop g5. Now this is something I recommend to do, bishop g5. Go bishop g5 always, you're guaranteed to exchange the dark squared bishop for black's knight. Now why is that? Here is the strategical idea. White wants to get control on light squares in the center. The way you do that is by eliminating the piece, which is black's knight on g8, on f6 when it develops, that will have anything to do with this central squares and with the diagonal, with the squares on a diagonal, central squares like d5 and e4. Now notice that once you take these pieces off the board, white's dark square bishop and black's knight, it's going to be white, by playing rook b1 and b4 and b5, is going to put substantial pressure on the light squares, and bishop on g2 is going to be very, very powerful. And it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, after exchanging those pieces, for black to play knight e7, c6, and make d5. So that means bishop on g2 is guaranteed to put a lot of pressure on this diagonal. Now let's see how it might look. In this position, it's black's move, and suppose black plays knight f6, we go bishop g5, black goes h6, bishop takes f6, and bishop takes f6 or queen takes f6. It does not really matter. Well, now you notice we're going to do the same thing if black went f5 first and then knight f6. We would have gone bishop g5 anyway. So idea is we did accomplish to exchange of these squares. Now those pieces. Now we're castling and black castles. Here is the beginning of our strategical idea. Not beginning, it's just a continuation. Rook to b1, bishop to g7, and here we go b4. Now remember, do not play knight d2 if you can go b4 without it. Here b4 we go because there is no e4 for black. Black goes f5, suppose. Now black is threatening to play e4 and attack two white's knights. They're both knights, and f3 and on c3 are in danger. So now we're going to go knight d2. So what we want to do next, suppose black plays prophylactic move king h7. How would game continue? We're going to go b5 after knight e7. I would like to exchange those knights. Now black's plan to have a counterattack on the king side without knight on e7 is very difficult to play on the king side. Here is what I mean by that. First of all, we want to exchange knights to increase pressure, to increase the activity of our bishop on g2. And once pieces are gone, well, after knight takes d5, we can exchange the activity of our bishop. By taking cd, we can shut off our bishop. Now this is correct way to play, because now we don't have this active bishop, but we have weak pawn. Black has weak pawn on c7, and we have very strong open file, open c file, and we can put a lot of pressure on their c pawn. It's very, very difficult for black to make a progress in this position. They can never play e4. We will never let them play e4, but if they go f4, that gives us comfortable square on e4 for the knight, or maybe even for the bishop. We have very good outpost in the center. Meanwhile, we continue to play queen c2, rook c1, and put as much pressure as possible on black's c pawn. Now suppose black does not take on d5. What we're going to do then? Then that's okay. We're going to go a4, a5, and a6. That's what our plan is, to put as much pressure as we can on black's queen side. If white goes g5, we can go e3. Now f4 is dangerous. As I told you before, that gives us very nice squares. Well, e4 is very good square. All of a sudden, white may be able to play queen h5 and bishop e4, and black's king may be in danger. So black has to be very careful the way they move pawns on the king side. So this may become very dangerous for them. So meanwhile, of course, we are not going to play queen h5 in this position, because it's like we're jumping with one piece and we have no threats. We will go queen h5 with the knight on d5. If black goes f4, then we go queen h5, then we're going to go bishop e4. You see, we have now good reason for going queen h5. For example, if in position like this, we may be able to give him check, take on e7, queen takes e7, and queen g6, creating big threats that black has very difficult time overcoming. So this position is interesting. We cannot analyze this position move by move. So you have to know one thing. We are with white. We try to put as much control in the center, and our bishop on g2 is very active. And by playing e3, we want to make sure if black makes one false move, we can get some kind of instant attack. And if black doesn't do that, then we're going to continue with our plan, a4, a5, and try to open position on the queen side. So this, I have played, I don't know, maybe a few hundred games of blitz games and tournament games, and I've always gotten very, very good positions for white. So this is something I would strongly recommend to play. Now going back to the original position now, again, let's see different ways of getting to this type of position. Now again, the way we got there was this. Just now we went c4, e5, knight c3, knight c6, and after g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, knight to f3, d6, and d3. Now suppose black does not go knight f6, they go f5. Well, we continue, we castle, and now if black goes knight e7, you know what to do. Bishop g5. Now we're going to exchange that knight on e7 for the bishop. And what is going to happen here? It's a little different. So we have the idea of exchanging bishops for a knight should still be the main idea. So if black castles, you can go rook b1. You see, you're intending to go b4. On h6, bishop takes e7. But the only difference here that black may capture it back with a knight. Okay, what do we do now? We cannot go b4. Remember, this is very important. Move like this may cost you a game right away because black has e4 attacking two white knights. Now white loses. So our plan is b4. We have to prepare by going knight to d2. Now we're ready to go for b4. Suppose black stops b4 by playing a5. This is only a matter of time when we will play b4. Now we're going a3 and we are preparing for b5, for b4. Now what is going to happen if black goes c6 and they want to go d5? In this particular case, this is not a good idea for black because we go b4 and after a takes b, a takes b. If they go d5, this may not be, well, this is not good for black because we're playing cd, queen goes to b3, and you see the pawn on d5 is lost because only way to protect for black is to go bishop e6 and then simply e4. You see, bishop is not protected, d5 pawn is pinned, and black does not have any way to hold the pawn on d5. So this is not going to work. Your plan remains the same. You want to go b4, then you want to go b5 and gain the control on this. They make this bishop very active and gain the control on weak central squares, on the light squares. And if black goes f4, then weakens more squares in the center, and eventually we can go e3 and we will have very, very interesting position to play. We're going to go a4, a5, and also knight d5 as we just looked a little while ago. So, but there are few details you should know about this position. There are a couple of dangers that we have to be aware of, and here they are. There are a little bit of tactical patterns that we have to learn here. Knight c6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, d3, d6. We go knight f3. Suppose black goes knight f6, bishop g5, h6, bishop takes, bishop takes. Now white castles, black castles. We go rook b1, black goes bishop g7. In this position, remember, don't play knight d2 unless you have to. If you can play b4 without going knight d2, do that. For example, here is what I saw a couple of times happen. In this position, well, white went something like knight b2 and black made general developing move like bishop d7 or bishop e6, and white went b4. Now this is interesting tactical shot here black has. Very unexpected and very powerful. After e4, black has an advantage here. This is very weird move because there are 4 ways white can capture the e4 pawn, and none of them are good. They all, any way white wants to capture this pawn, they lose. Obviously, capturing with a pawn just drops the knight. Capturing with a bishop also drops the knight. And capturing either knight, if it takes on e4, after f5, white wins a piece. You see, knight on e4 moves, and knight on c3 will be lost. And if white takes with a c knight, same move, f5, trapping the white knight in the center. So, well, after e4 we may have to go queen c2, then after e takes d, black has great position. But now let's look at this little different way. So we are not going to go knight d2 because we don't have to go. Suppose black goes f5. I'm not going move by move. I'm just explaining the ideas. And knight d2, and let's look at what are the consequences of e4 move now. That's a big difference between position. The difference is pawn on f7 or pawn on f5, which is very big. We could go queen c2 after f5 in this position. We can go even knight d5, and after ed and ed, pawn on f5 stands badly because it blocks white's bishop, black's light square bishop. Then we can go rook a1, possibly knight f4. So the difference between this position and this position is huge. Pawn on f5 stands real badly. So we can simply go rook e1, then maybe knight b3 and b5, and if black somehow puts the knight in the center, this knight can easily be exchanged after knight b3, and again activity with a pawn on f5, activity of bishop on g2 will give white certain advantage. Now those positions, you're gonna love them a lot more once you play them a lot, and once you get hang of them, you need some experience playing those positions. But believe me, comparing this way to play has big advantage over other plays. It has some disadvantages too. The advantage that I know a lot of average to medium medium to good players, they love to get comfortable position without with a clear plan and without going through too much trouble in learning opening variations. Now in c4 and e5 type of positions, there is one thing. When we go knight c3 and knight c6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, and knight f3, d6, and we castled or we play d3, black goes f5 and we castle. Suppose black here will not let you go bishop g5, and suppose they go h6. Now, what do we do then? Then we have a plan. We have to change our plan a little bit. Well, there are two ways to play this position for white. We can go, one is rook b1. We continue the way we would have played even after bishop g5 in exchanging for black's knight. So we continue rook b1. Suppose black goes knight f6. You go b4. Same plan. Well, notice you can go b4 after knight f6, but you cannot play b4 if black goes knight e7. Remember the same e4 threat, attacking two white knights on c3 and on f3. But on knight f6, you can go b4. If black castles, now you have the same plan, b5, knight e7, a4. And the difference here, if black tries to play c6 and d5, they may run into a serious problem. Well, suppose they go c6. Here is the problem number one. c6 followed by d5 is a bad idea here, because we're going to play either b takes c right away, which is after b takes c, we have c5 giving us a clear advantage. You see, if black goes d takes c, we play knight takes e5, doubling black's pawns and getting the central pawn, and queen d4 attacking two knights is not going to help black, because white simply has queen b3 check, followed by knight f3 or knight takes c6. So this is not going to work. As a pattern, remember, when e5 pawn, black's e5 pawn protected only once, you always have a chance to play c5. And then you assess, there are various different cases where c5 may be good, and then there are cases when c5 is not good. And this is the clear example of the perfect position for the c5. So, and if black goes e4, we play c takes d. And if they take on f3, we take on e7. And you can tell white is easily winning here, because black has to capture the pawn on e7, and we'll play bishop takes f3. So that's what happens when we just have the same plan. When black plays h6, we go b4, b5, then a4, a5, and continue. As an additional possibility for white, I want to introduce you to a different idea to play this position. Well, the different idea is this. After a c4, e5, knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6, actually I explored that idea. It's a relatively different way. f5, castle, h6. Actually, those moves, this position is very common position, and it may be reached with different move order. So black could have gone g6 on the first move and d6 on the first move, and knight c6 could have been played earlier, sooner or later. It doesn't matter, because since there is no confrontation of pieces, move order does not make any difference. So in this position, there is another way to play for white. Is interesting way to go e4. Now, what's the idea of move e4? Now, black has to be very careful. So, for instance, if black goes knight f6, knight h4 is very interesting move. Attacking f5 and g6. You cannot go g5 because knight takes f5, and g6 pawn is hanging, and protecting g6 pawn with a king, for example, king f7, may be very dangerous, because white opens the position by playing f4. So this may be very dangerous for black. Also, on knight f6, on knight e7 here, we could go knight d5, or we could go we could play for d4. For example, we could go bishop e3, and after castle maybe e takes f, and if g takes f, possible d4 continuations. Of course you have to watch out for f4. Or after e4, which is knight e7, you could go rook b1 followed by b4 and b5. So that's the way, which, well, I said you cannot go b4 because e4 is going to win the piece for black. So if you stop it by going e4, that's another way to play. Then white can go f4, and it's completely different game. It's not as a clear-cut plan as in the first case, which I recommended more, especially for those who does not have much experience in English. Just go to b4, b5 as a general plan, and watch out for e4 move as a tactical shot before I told you, and watch out for e4 when you lose a piece, when black after b4 attacks two knights. So knowing these pitfalls, there's some very few danger points, and knowing your general plan that you're gonna play in c4, e5 continuations will give you an easier life. So the last thing after c4, e5, knight c3, I want to tell you when black plays knight f6. It's not the last thing, it's actually very common way to play for black. Well, as I already mentioned, we can go knight f3, knight c6, and d3 and play some kind of like a Sicilian defense for white with extra tempo. But also you could go g3 and bishop b4, bishop g2. We already looked at this position, then we simply continue knight f3 and go knight d5. But here, after g3, there is a way for black to start immediate operations in the center. They go c6, trying to go d5. And here white has to be very precise. First, if they play passively, just standard moves, bishop g2, d5, this position already good position for black. So bishop g2 is not to be played, and the reason why this position is good, I'll just show you, just to enlighten you show you a few variations. Queen b3 moves is winning a pawn. There's a couple of dangers in this position. One of them is knight c6. After knight c6, white can win a pawn. Knight takes d5. We remember, this is the continuation we try to stay away from. Bishop g2 is the move in this position that we are not going to play. Now let's see here. Knight d5, knight d4, knight takes f6, queen takes f6. This is the bad position for white. White has an extra pawn. Queen is hanging. Queen a4 check is pointless because bishop d7, and white has to play queen d1 anyway to stop knight c2 check. So suppose white goes bishop, queen d1 right away. We go bishop f5, threatening knight c2 check. Obviously e4 is bad because we can simply go rook c8. Same knight c2 check is threatening, or even if black simply goes bishop e6, this is a bad position. So after bishop f5, d3, then rook c8, threatening knight c2 check, and after rook b1 or king f1, on both cases, bishop c5, now black has a threat of knight b3 attacking, well, after bishop e6. Actually, knight b3 is not a threat. They may want to go bishop g4 and then knight b3 attacking, checkmate here. But in this position, if white goes knight f3, black simply castles. This is not the position you want to play with white. And if you take on d4, bishop takes d4, you see you have an extra pawn for white. But you don't know where you're going to hide your king. And black doubles on c-file. This is very dangerous, maybe lost position for white. That's not something you want to play. So c6 is the way for black to try to gain the initiative in very early stage of the game. c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, g3, c6. The move I would recommend here, actually there are two moves. One is d4 and one is knight f3. I would recommend knight f3. And after knight f3, e4, knight d4, and here black has two different ways to play this position. One of them is old move d5. after which I'm almost sure white has significant advantage. C takes D, and on queen b6, knight to b3. And after c takes d, just to go simply d3 or bishop g2 first, followed by d3, and black has certain problems with their pawn center. Look some reference games in the database. You can find a lot of games which will prove my assessment. The other move is queen to b6. Now after queen to b6, with the idea of going d5, we have a couple of opportunities. One of them is knight b3 move, but then black goes a5 and gets reasonably good positions. And let me show you those variations. So after knight b3, if black goes a5, what should white do? a4 is a threat. If white goes d4, probably the best move. a4, and now white can go knight d2 right away, or first goes c5, then black goes queen b4, knight d2, and queen takes d4. Now this position is okay for black. Actually, it's good position for black. After knight takes e4, queen takes d1, bishop is still on f1. In this position, king takes d1, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and d5. That's the key move that gives black a good game. And after c takes d, f5, followed by bishop takes to d6. Knight c3, bishop takes d6, and black has no problems. Now let's go to this position again and look at this variation. Now what did we do here for white, and that was wrong, that we didn't get any advantage? Again, c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, g3, c6. We went knight f3, e4, knight d4, queen b6, and we went knight to b3. Now the correct move is not knight b3. There is a possible move knight c2, which I also don't like very much because of same d5. The move I do like here for white, and I would strongly recommend, if you have this position, it's a counterintuitive move that is based on the concrete calculation. The move is e3. Why this move doesn't look that hot? Because creates a lot of weaknesses on light squares, weakness on f3, weakness on d3. And when black goes d5, now based on white's next move, it determines that's why we did the e3. It's all based on next move, which is queen to c2. This is very strong move. Now let's explain something. Black just connected and make strong their center. If black somehow manages to hold on to their pawn structure in the center, black is going to have very good position. So white has to stop it. Queen c2 creates very strong threat. The threat is c takes d, and knight takes d5, and you see the bishop on c8 is loose. Well, of course white has some way, black has some way to stop it. Now what can black do? Bishop on c8 is loose, so bishop has to either come out or knight has to come out to protect the bishop on c8. Now let's look at that. If knight goes to a6, white is gonna create problems for black by simply going a3, and you will see that later b4 white can play, and knight on a6 is very uncomfortable. After knight to d7, it's even a lot worse. Then white goes c takes d, and knight c to b5, and there is no good way to stop knight c7 check, and king to d8 definitely does not qualify as good way preventing it. Now white simply can go bishop g2 and later on d3, maybe even b3 and bishop b2. With king on d8, you do not expect to have comfortable life. So now if black develops the bishop, where can they develop the bishop? If develop the bishop on g4 after h3, it doesn't look like this bishop can go anywhere. On bishop h5, now they run into different problem. Black runs c takes d, and now g4, and after bishop g6, g5, simply winning the game because knight has to move, and then knight takes d5. So what I want to say here, this is not something you can see in theoretical books and encyclopedias, but queen c2 is a very interesting move that creates these problems, and there is no comfortable way for black to solve this problem. I think the best way is to play bishop b4, and after c takes d, to play bishop takes c3. But then I think black is not in good shape. Pawn is on g3. We can simply play b takes c, and after c takes d, bishop to a3. Black's position is very bad. They cannot castle, centralized piece for knight on d4, and if black goes something like knight d7, bishop g2, knight e5, white simply castles, and black cannot castle, and knight on d3 just shooting blanks, and knight stands very nicely on d3 but doesn't really do anything. Black has bigger problems, such as their king and position is very, very bad. So in this position on the queen b6, we do play e3, and suppose black does not play to d5, but you see they must eventually play d5 because pawn on e4 needs attention after bishop g2, but suppose they play bishop to c5 first. Then we simply can play knight b3, attacking the c5 bishop, attacking because the threat is knight to a4, and black must go back to bishop e7, and then we simply play bishop g2. Now we attack the d5 pawn, e4 pawn, and after d5 we can simply play c takes d, and then d3, and it's too much pressure on the e4 pawn. If black plays ed, queen takes d3, black made this queen b6 move, bishop c5 and bishop e7 move, and they never had a chance to keep their pawn on e4, and now they left with isolated pawn on d5 that is hanging immediately and behind in development. So their opening idea was clear failure. So this is my brief introduction on the third move, c6, and a brief summary to that. After c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, g3 and c6, play knight f3, and after e4, knight d4, and now if you play correctly on d5, you simply take c takes d, queen b6, knight b3, followed by d3, bishop g2 and castle, and on queen b6 in this position, you play e3, and on d5, queen c2, very powerful move, giving you advantage. So c6 idea on move 3, if you approach it correctly, is not a good idea for black. Well, actually, in the variation bishop c5, I did say that knight b3 is a good move, which is good move, but knight a4 may be even better. So bishop c5 is not even an idea. So this is very good position for white. This is the summary of the c6 continuation, and I think this will conclude c4 e5 chapter of English. This is one type of English, and the other type of English is c4 c5, which we will discuss now. But before we move there, I want to tell you a couple of things here. Black may start with knight f6, and you don't know what they want to play. They may want to play c6, second move e6 or e5, so you make your universal move knight c3, and now if they go e5, you transpose to one of the variations we just discussed with e5, or if they go c5, you are in a different area of English, which we are about to start now, and if they go g6, it's the third variation. So c4, knight f6, knight c3, also they can go c6 or e6, which is a little departure from English. It's not really English opening. So c4, let's go with c5, knight to c3, or knight to f3. Now they are both acceptable continuations. Knight to c3, knight to c6. Now we go g3, black goes g6, bishop to g2, bishop to g7, and knight to f3. Now this position was for a long time and for many years considered as good position, at least equal position for black. Black, they said, should go e5, or even knight f6 is okay, but e5 they were recommending with a very good play for black. Now white castles, black goes d6, white goes knight e1, knight to e7, knight to c2, black goes bishop e6, and white plays d3, and when black castles, white goes rook to b1, a5, white goes a3, and now black goes d5. Now this is something that did happen in my game. Now what is the white's plan here, and why this position is good, or is it good? Yes, it is. I played b3 in this position against Hungarian Grandmaster Ribli. It was many years ago. And this is very interesting plan. This is the only game I think was played by using this plan. And what white wants to do, they want to go e4. Actually, that's what happened. Black played h6 just to prevent bishop g5 in the future. For example, on f5, maybe bishop g5. Now, if black goes d4, then knight to a4 or knight to e4 may be very good, attacking the c5 pawn, and after b6, white goes b4, having great position. And that's another reason why h6 is played, to prevent on f5 knight g5 move. So h6 is not the move to blame black for. So h6 with pawn on d5, and white, I played e4, and I got a better position after that. Now black has choices. What should they do? If they take d takes c, it's a huge positional mistake, because white simply goes b takes c, followed by knight d5, and they have open file, open b file for rook, knight on d5, and clear advantage. So closing d4 also very good for white, because they go knight to d5, and what happened in a game, d takes e, and then knight takes e4. Black must protect the b6 pawn by playing the c5 pawn by playing b6, and then I played knight c3 back, followed by knight to e3 and knight to d5. White has an advantage here. Look at the game. I think it was played in 1978 in Holland in WKZ tournament. So in this position, this is the interesting plan. I would introduce it. Let me show you once more what is the idea of this plan. c4, e5, c4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, and here we go knight f3. Now, if black goes e5, what they want to do, they want comfortable d6, bishop, knight e7, and followed by f5, which is a good plan. And in this position, black goes e5, white castles, and black goes knight e7 or d6, which is the same. Knight e7, knight e1, pawn to d6, knight to c2. White is heading towards the d5 square with a knight. Knight to c2. When black castled, we go rook to b1. Now, before white plays knight e3 and knight to d5, they try to make b4 move. b4, it's another idea, so they want to open the b file, and they want to force black to play a5, which weakens more black's position on the queen side. And after a5, we go a3, bishop e6, attacking the c4 pawn, we go d3. Now that allows black to go d5, which they don't have to, but we want to play b4. Now when black goes d5, then we support it with b3, and now it's clear that white wants to go e4 and get some positional advantage. So that's not really a big danger for black, but it's kind of difficult for black to find constructive plan. Where do they want to play? They cannot they cannot keep pawn on d5, keep protecting it and keep it alive, because e4 is the next move. So by pushing, white's light square opens and white goes knight e4, and this is a great variety of the King's Indian with the reverse color. And d takes c is clearly bad because it opens the b file, and black has really dilemma what to do with the d pawn, and I don't know there is a 100% comfortable way to solve this problem. So I think white still has some advantage in this position. Now going back, now we see there are bunch of different continuations for black. So, and again, these continuations after c4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7. This is symmetrical. Knight f3. Now, we just discussed move e5. There is move e6 black can play. Well, after e6, there are ways to play with white. One is castle, and after knight e7, or maybe even before castling, going d4, and if black captures with a pawn, then knight b5. Actually, very interesting continuation. Or which is also interesting in this position, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and if bishop takes d4, the same knight b5, attacking the bishop. It's just an idea for brain. And on bishop e5, you can go bishop f4. So we are sacrifice the pawn with white. But you see, the idea is to get knight d6 and to discourage black's development. And black may have some serious problems in this position. Of course, there is move d5. It's an idea of this pawn sacrifice. But of course, there's the old way to play, simply developing in this position. Bishop g2, knight e7, castle, when black castles, and white can simply go d3, d5. This system was successfully tried with by Bobby Fischer against Petrosian in USSR versus the rest of the world match in 70s. So in this position, white can simply go for a3 and b4. There are a lot of different ways to play this position. There is a bishop d2 move followed by queen c1. There is a3 followed by rook b1 and b4. This was all played. I don't have my formed opinion about it, but this is definitely comfortable position for white. So e6, knight e7 is not played that often, but I think what is played in this position most often is the knight f6 move that gives move that creates symmetrical position. Castles, d4, c takes d, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. Before we play knight takes d4, I want to tell you quickly that there is a move d6 in this position with a pawn sacrifice, which is clearly insufficient because bishop takes c6 is the best way to take this pawn. Knight takes c6, and after queen c7 or queen d7, it doesn't matter, white goes knight d5, having clear advantage. Black cannot take queen takes c6 because of knight takes c7 check. So this position, this pawn sacrifice, was played few times but does not really have any followers now. So knight takes d4, queen takes d4, d6, queen to d3, a6, and this position is very well known. It's hard to get an advantage here for white. The move I would recommend is bishop g5, and when black goes rook to b8, here I would recommend move that was never, well, with exception I played it a couple of times, but other than that it was never played by anyone else. The move is c5. It's a pure pawn sacrifice. I had it twice, and both times my opponent or grandmasters, both times they took a long time in this position, and they did not take the pawn on c5. Let me show you, when you give a grandmaster pawn in the early stage of the game, they take long time, and they don't accept this sacrifice there clearly must be a reason. And here is the reason. D takes C. I don't know, I never asked them how far they saw into this continuation, but whatever they saw, they didn't like it very correctly. Queen takes D8, rook takes D8, and now bishop F4, simply attacking the rook on B8. Next few moves are very natural. Rook A8, knight to A4. Now white has two threats. One is knight takes C5, which is by far not the main threat. Main threat is knight to B6, attacking rook on A8, and after rook A7, bishop to B8. Now you see black has a problem. They cannot comfortably live with the C8 bishop because B7 pawn is hanging, bishop on G2. So if they go knight D7, they protect the B6 square, they protect the C5 pawn, and they are keeping an extra pawn, but that's not a good position for black. White goes rook F to D1, pinning the rook on D8, pinning the knight on D7, threatening same knight B6 move. Rook has to move to E8, or whatever. So now rook A to C1. You see how picture dramatically changed. White is completely developed, and they have absolutely no problem of getting the pawn on C5 back. Meanwhile, black has great difficulties completing development. How they going to develop bishop on C8, and what they going to do with knight on D7? On move like E5, white goes bishop E3, and we see clear and unconditional domination of white's pieces over black. Black's position is next to lost. Maybe it is lost. So this is the pawn sacrifice that I would recommend, and as I mentioned before, it's very bad for, as I mentioned just now, it's very bad for black to accept it. So in both cases, my opponents played queen A5, on which I cannot take on D6, because then queen is going to take the bishop on G5. So my move was bishop takes F6, bishop takes F6, now C takes D, E takes D, and this position is a very interesting position. This position is, I think, a little better for white. White should never accept the pawn on D6, because after queen takes D6, black would play bishop E6 followed by rook D8 and rook C8, and you see complete change in position. Now black is a pawn down, but they have very strong initiative. Both bishops aiming to white's queen side, and rook D8 coming with a tempo followed by rook C8. And bishop takes B7 is not good after rook B8. So white does not have any advantage, maybe even the other way around. So we don't want to take this pawn, but what we can do here is simply play rook to B1 or knight to D5, and after bishop takes B2, rook to B1, white has an advantage here. And this position was analyzed by me in one of the games that I played. I did play knight D5 and black went bishop to G7. White had advantage after B4 most of the game. Game ended in a draw, but I had solid advantage most of the game. This is actually an interesting way to play for white. Now going back to the position after C4, C5, black may attempt to make few ways, they have several ways they can try, even after knight c3 here, knight c6, g3. They may make an attempt after knight f6, bishop g2 to open the center, playing e6, for example, and next move d5. Well, let me tell you this. If black goes e6 in this position, we will go knight f3. And after d5, we're going to get different position. It's not going to be English anymore. This is Tarrasch. C takes d, one of the varieties of the Queen's Gambit declined. And as I said, when you play English, you have to be prepared for the game to transpose to some other opening. And this is one of the examples of it. So black has two ways they can capture on d5. So let's look at the most common way to capture with a pawn. We go d4, and black goes bishop e7, white castles, black castles. This is one of the most common positions of the Tarrasch defense. How do we play Tarrasch defense? Well, I know this is our subject is English, but in case you transpose to Tarrasch, which you cannot help if you want to get some initiative. So you have variation that I recommend is bishop e3, attacking c5 pawn, and black has 1, 2, and 3 different ways to play this position. One of them is cd, the other one is c4, and the third one is knight to g4. Knight g4 is not something can be recommended, even one of the possible variations. On knight g4, we simply can go bishop f4. Knight is totally misplaced on g4. And c takes d will be knight takes d4, followed by rook c1. You have a very solid position with some advantage, which you can look in Tarrasch defense. You know, there are very many games you can look at them. And the third one is c4, on which we play knight to e5. And now, I had this position very many times, and maybe 80 or 90 even % of the games continued bishop e6, giving white clear advantage. Possible continuations are here also h6. After h6, before we go to bishop e6, which is the main move, let's look at what will happen after h6. After h6, you can simply go b3 to blow up black's center, and if black plays c takes b, queen takes b3 gives white clear advantage. So let's go to bishop e6 move. Now we have a small combination here, which will give us clear positional advantage. Knight takes c4, d takes c, and now d5, fork, and knight takes d5 is probably the best respond here. Then knight takes d5, and you see that white can always get two bishop advantage, whether black takes on d5 or white takes on e7. And on move something like bishop f6, white can go rook c1, bishop takes b2, rook takes c4. This is clear and maybe even big advantage for white. What they want to do, if black goes rook c8, for example, we can go rook c2, attacking the bishop on b2, which is coming back to e5 or a3. It doesn't really matter. We're going to go rook to d2, and you see our knight on d5 is very strong. And if queen a5, then maybe knight f4. We have good advantage for white here. Maybe even instead of knight f4, maybe we can go queen b3 and rook d1. This is very good position, and I think white is clearly better. Threat is queen takes b7. So this is good position. So this is as much as you need to know in Tarash. But if you want to look at this position and adapt different variation of Tarash, you can definitely go look in the databases, find the different ways white can play in Tarash. But our topic here, main discussion, is English opening. So now, and to sum up quickly, I want to tell you that there is another possible variety of Tarash. Bishop g2, e6, knight f3, d5, cd, knight takes d5. Then we castle, and on bishop e7, you may go d4 or you may go knight takes d5. In both cases, after d4, I think you have some advantage. I don't know how big is the advantage, but white is better here. In a castle, you can go e4, and after knight b6, you can go d5, ed, ed, and a knight b4, knight e1, very strong move, stopping bishop f5 and knight c2. Eventually, next move, white is going to kick black's knight. So for now, by playing knight e1, we're protecting the d5 pawn. Next, we're going to go a3, and knight is going to go from c2, then bishop e3, rook e1. White has comfortable position. So this is the summary of our variety of Queen's Gambit declined, which is Tarash defense or Tarash variation, whichever way you want to call it. And that's how it happens again: c4, c5, knight c3, knight c6, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, and if black goes e6, again we can go knight f3, and after d5, cd. Okay, so this, we covered this variety of Tarash. Then again, after c4, c5, knight c3, knight f6, there is another possibility for black. Black can get here after g3, black can play in this position e6. Now they want to get d5. So they cannot go b6 because after bishop g2, they cannot play bishop b7. So they find a way to put bishop on b7. In order to put for black bishop on b7, they have to go e6. And this is very tricky. Why? Because now bishop g2 is not such a good move, because black is going to go d5 followed by d4, and they're going to gain tempo on white's knight on c3, because d4 is not so comfortable for white, because after cd we have to capture with the queen, and knight is going to go to c6 with the tempo. So in order for this